So again, today, natural science teaches that the world is 4.6 billion years old and teach it as though it's an absolute fact. Well, where do they get this from? Especially when there are literally hundreds of physical processes that set an upper limit on the age of the earth that is less than a billion years. Again, they're cherry picking the data that supports their worldview and excluding data that does not. Well, when secular scientists talk about absolute dates of things, of geologic epochs, for example, like the Jurassic period, their measurements for determining such dates come almost exclusively from what is called radiometric dating. Let me explain in brief what radiometric dating is. Now, radioactivity or radiation is the spontaneous emission of particles from unstable atoms that are disintegrating. And this dating technique uses the decay rates of these radioactive atoms to assign dates to rocks. But this technique has many problems and numerous unsupported assumptions, including we don't know the original amount of parent material that was there. We don't know the amount of daughter material that might have been there originally. We don't know if the decay rate has been constant. We don't know if it's has been a closed system or has been subject to contaminations of parent material or daughter material. Lots of problems with radiometric dating. It's important for you also to know that fossils cannot be dated directly with this type of dating method. You can't date fossils using radiometric dating. It is used to date igneous rocks, or what you might call volcanic rocks, and thereby determining the minimum age of the overlying sedimentary rocks, the rocks that fossils are found in. But there have also been numerous published examples of flawed dates given by this method. For example, when igneous rocks of the Grand Canyon were analyzed, different radiometric dating techniques rendered different dates. And one, you'll note here, the most accurate at the time, the rubidium-strontium isochron technique, gave a date for the Precambrian flow, the one on the bottom, that was hundreds of millions of years younger than the more recent flow that had cascaded over the rim of the Grand Canyon. Well, we're going to come back to the topic of radiometric dating a little bit later and review some more evidence that calls that dating technique into question as I now walk through a summary of some of the top evidences for a young Earth. Kind of a top 10-ish list of evidence for a young Earth, but it's actually 11. So my top 11 list. First, number one, there is very little sediment on the seafloor for an Earth supposedly 4.6 billion years old. Now, every year, water and wind erode about 20 billion tons of dirt and rock debris from the continents and deposits them on the seafloor. Most of this material accumulates as loose sediments near the continents, yet the average thickness of all of these sediments globally over the whole seafloor is not even 1,300 feet. Well, some sediments appear to be being removed by tectonic plates as they slide slowly, about 1 inch or 2 per year beneath the continents. An estimated 1 billion tons of sediments are removed this way each year. That's a net gain of about 19 billion tons per year. At this rate, 1,300 feet of sediments would accumulate in less than 12 million years, not billions of years. This evidence makes sense within the context of the global flood, not the idea of slow and gradual geologic evolution. In the latter stages of the year-long global flood, water swiftly drained off the emerging lands, dumping its sediment-choked loads offshore. Thus, most seafloor sediments accumulated rapidly only about 4,300 years ago. Number two, we also find bent rock layers that are inexplicable if these are truly ancient. In many mountainous areas, rock layers thousands of feet thick have been bent and folded without fracturing. The stratofolds in this photo are at the Zagros Mountains along the southwest coast of Iran by the Persian Gulf. Now, how can this happen if these layers were laid down separately over hundreds of millions of years and already hardened? Or take a look at these folds near the Sullivan River in southern British Columbia, Canada. So you see hardened rock layers are brittle. Try bending a slab of concrete sometime to see what happens. But if concrete is still wet, it can easily be shaped and molded before the cement sets. The same principle applies to sedimentary rock layers. They can be bent and folded soon after the sediment is deposited, before the natural cementation has a chance to bind the particles together into hard or brittle rocks. The Grand Canyon, you can see on the far right of this diagram, cuts through many rock layers. At some point, all of these layers were raised to the current elevation, forming a raised flat region called the Kaibab Plateau, which is part of the larger Colorado Plateau. Somehow, this whole sequence was bent and folded without fracturing. And note on the diagram the time difference between the first deposits at the Grand Canyon, the Tapete Sandstone, which was deposited 520 million years ago, and the conventionally accepted date of the bending, 70 million years ago. That's 450 million years later. If the Tapete Sandstone was deposited over North America 450 million years before being folded, well, it being folded in such a way is just not possible. But all the layers would still be relatively soft and pliable if it all happened during the recent global flood. Number 3, we find lots and lots of fossilized soft tissues. A great many published discoveries of soft tissues like stomach contents and skin now exist that date by conventional methods well beyond 100 million years. The preservation of skin, blood vessels, cells, and complex molecules is entirely consistent with the young Earth model and the rapid burial during the global flood, but it's highly implausible for organisms that supposedly died off millions of years ago. Let me give you one specific example. In 2005, a Tyrannosaurus rex was discovered in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana by North Carolina State University professor, paleontologist Dr. Mary Schweitzer. Well, due to its immense weight, the femur, after being wrapped in plaster Paris, weighed 3,000 pounds, so it had to be broken in half to be transported out of the area by helicopter. Upon unpacking the boxes containing the bone fragments in her lab, she immediately noticed that inside the bone there was what appeared to be medullary bone tissue, which prompted further microscopic analysis. From the marrow cavity, Schweitzer found soft, flexible tissue that upon treatment could be stretched and would return to its original form. Well, since the T-Rex is believed to have gone extinct 65 million years ago, soft tissue was completely unexpected. In her amazement, she also found what appeared to be blood vessels with what she believed were red blood cells. The vessels were even revealed to be lined with special bone endothelial cells. Well, initially, skeptical scientists suggested that bacterial biofilms formed what only appeared to be blood vessels and blood cells. However, more recently, Schweitzer and co-workers found biochemical evidence for intact fragments of the protein collagen, which is a component of connective tissue. This is important because collagen is a highly distinctive protein that is not made by bacteria. So what she found were not bacterial biofilms, they were actually blood vessels and red blood cells from a T-Rex. Now, if you remember Jurassic Park, that's how they brought back those dinosaurs, right? It was from Number 4 from our list of top 11 is what are called Lazarus bacteria. This is another evidence for a young Earth that was discovered only in 2000. These were bacteria named Lazarus bacteria. The scientists claim to have resurrected bacteria that were found in salt crystals conventionally dated at 250 million years old. The scientists were tremendously surprised to find, upon their analysis, intact DNA was still present after 250 million supposed years. Well, DNA normally breaks down quickly, even in ideal conditions. Even evolutionists agree that DNA in bacterial spores, a dormant state of bacteria, should not last more than 1 million years. They were moreover shocked that the bacterial's DNA was very similar to modern bacterial DNA. If the modern bacteria were the result of 250 million years of evolution, its DNA should be very different from the Lazarus bacteria DNA based on known mutation rates. However, the discovery of Lazarus bacteria is not shocking or surprising when we base our expectations on the biblical account. Noah's flood likely deposited those salt beds, which are in reality only about 4,500 years old. Such DNA is much more likely to be intact and similar to modern bacteria. Number 5, another indicator of a young Earth is the minimal amount of salt that is in the sea. See, every year, large amounts of salts are dumped into the oceans from rivers and glaciers and underground seepage and volcanic dust. An estimated 458 million tons of sodium is deposited into the ocean every year. Only 122 million tons, about 27% of what is deposited each year, is removed by natural processes. If seawater originally contained no sodium, no salt, and the sodium all accumulated at today's rates, then today's ocean's saltiness would be reached in only 42 million years. Only about 1/70th the 3 billion year evolutionists propose. But those assumptions failed to take into account the likelihood that God created a saltwater ocean for all the sea creatures when he made them on day 5. Also, the year-long global flood cataclysm must have dumped an unprecedented amount of salt to the ocean through erosion, sedimentation, and volcanism. So today's ocean saltiness makes much better sense within the biblical time scale of about 6,000 years. Well, our final evidence for a young Earth comes from radiometric dating. Our final evidences comes from radiometric dating. Now, their number 6 is the existence of substantial helium found in rocks where radiometric decay has taken place that reveals that there's a major problem with one of the major assumptions of radiometric dating, and that is that radioactive atoms decay at constant rates. Now remember, radiation is the spontaneous emission of particles from unstable atoms that are disintegrating. Now there are several types of radioactive decay or radioactive emissions, several types of particles that are given off. You have alpha decay, you have beta decay, you have what are called gamma rays. Anyone that knows their sci-fi will know that it was gamma rays that made the Incredible Hulk. So yeah, it's one of your radioactive decays types. Well, radioactive elements will continue to decay, losing particles, becoming increasingly smaller atoms through what is called a decay series until they eventually become a stable element like lead, and no further decay will take place. Well, in the type of decay called alpha decay, for example, in uranium atoms, like the one shown here, they lose particles with 2 protons and 2 neutrons. This is a massive particle, which is actually a helium nuclei. So these massive particles with 2 protons and 2 neutrons come flying off of these radioactive particles, and these things will go right through you. That's why when you're getting x-rays and stuff, they will protect you with a lead vest. Well, during the radioactive decay of elements like uranium and thorium that are found in rocks, lots of helium is produced during their decay. For example, during the decay of uranium-238 to lead, 8 helium atoms are lost. Okay? Now, these radioactive elements can be found in crystals, but because helium is a tiny element, the second lightest element of all the noble gases, and does not combine with other elements as it's produced by nuclear decay, it readily diffuses or leaks out of crystals and eventually escapes into the atmosphere. You probably have experience with this if you've ever had a helium balloon. You know they don't last forever. That's because helium's a tiny little atom and can squeeze its way right out of that rubber balloon, being lost in the atmosphere. Sadly, we lose our helium balloons that way. Well, a creation science research team called the RATE Group decided that helium measurements might be an alternative method for determining the date of rocks. The RATE Group shown here was formed from scientists with the Institute for Creation Research and the Creation Research Society, who collaborated on an extensive 3-year project to study the factors that might affect radiometric dating. They included specialists in geology, geophysics, astrophysics, and physics. The RATE group called themselves that. RATE is an acronym which stands for radioisotopes and the age of the Earth. So they were specifically investigating radiometric dating techniques to understand what this was really all about and why these erroneous dates were being found today by scientists. Well, based on the assumption that the Earth was young, they decided to check to see if helium could be found in rocks. Samples of granite were obtained and analyzed by the RATE group researchers from deep Precambrian, that is pre-flood granite rocks in New Mexico. From these rocks, they extracted samples of zircon crystals from different depths. The melting temperature of zirconium silicate is so high that zircon crystals can even go through a volcano and come out intact. Zircons you might recognize as crystals used to make less expensive gemstones for rings, etc. Here's a look at some tiny zircon crystals. They isolated from rocks that have been magnified under a standard optical microscope here. And here's another view of a single crystal from a high-powered scanning electron microscope. Well, they analyzed the helium content of zircon crystals in granite, which they obtained from the Los Alamos National Laboratory geothermal drilling site in New Mexico. To their surprise, they found far more helium present in the zircons than expected, even assuming the rocks were young. In rock dated to 1.5 billion years old by radiometric dating, up to 58% of the helium that the uranium could have ever generated in 1.5 billion years was still present in the crystals. When the helium diffusion rates at the various temperatures were plotted, the diffusivity of helium provided excellent confirmation of the predictions made by the young Earth model. You could see from the graph that diffusion rates were consistent with the young Earth predictions, but varied considerably from those based on old Earth assumptions. Well, the excess helium present in those zircon crystals was interpreted by the RATE group as indicating that accelerated nuclear decay had taken place. They produced this animation to illustrate the process they believe was taking place. The hourglass on the left illustrates the uranium on the top decaying into lead on the bottom. The hourglass on the right shows the helium that was being produced in the upper chamber and diffusing out of the rocks into the lower chamber. The results suggest that at some point, God accelerated the nuclear decay process, causing uranium to decay into lead at a much faster rate, producing helium in the process. But because the diffusion of helium out of the zircon crystals is a mechanical process, not a nuclear process, that rate was not affected. The decay of uranium occurred at a much faster rate, while the diffusion of helium occurred at a normal rate. And at some point, the accelerated rate of nuclear decay returned to what we have today. Now, I've often pondered this, the evidence of accelerated nuclear decay that they have found in these rocks in the fossil record. If there was accelerated nuclear decay happening during the global flood, which seems to be what we find, then that kind of begs a question. And this is only my thinking here, okay? And usually in my teaching, I find what the experts say, and then I try to summarize that for you in layman terms. But if accelerated nuclear decay was taking place during the global flood, then it kind of begs a question whether the accelerated nuclear decay was a consequence. It's either going to be a consequence or a cause. There's a cause or consequence connection if it was happening during the flood. So did the flood itself cause, did it cause? Was the accelerated nuclear decay a consequence of the global flood somehow? Or potentially was it the cause? Interestingly, according to geophysicists, the reason why the Earth's core is molten is because of the heat generated by nuclear decay. Now, we don't know how God caused the global flood. Could have been a mighty finger of God that broke apart the earth, causing the flood. Some view an astronomical event. a bombardment of asteroids or something of the sort, breaking the Earth's crust up. But what if you accelerated nuclear decay? Caused massive heat to be generated in the interior of the Earth? Could that have broken the Earth apart, causing the global flood? I don't know, but it's an interesting thought that some geophysicists should pursue, in my thinking. Well, in addition, the helium leakage rate from zircons has been determined in several experiments, which showed that helium diffuses so rapidly that all the helium in these zircon crystals should have leaked out into the atmosphere in less than 100,000 years. The fact that so much helium is still in the rocks means they cannot be 1.5 billion years old, as the radiometric dating suggested. In fact, using the measured rate of helium diffusion, these pre-flood rocks have an average diffusion age of only 6,000 years, plus or minus 2,000. Another evidence for a young Earth is the low amount of helium in the atmosphere. The leakage rate of helium gas into the atmosphere has been measured. Even though some helium escapes into outer space, the amount still present is not nearly enough if the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. In fact, if we assume no helium was in the atmosphere originally, all the helium would have accumulated in only 1.5 million years. But when the catastrophic flood upheaval is factored in, which rapidly released huge amounts of helium into the atmosphere, it could have accumulated in only 6,000 years. Well, number 7 is that carbon-14 has been found in fossils, rocks, and diamonds, where it should not be. Now, carbon-14 is another radiometric dating technique. Carbon-14 is itself a radioactive form of carbon, an unstable form of carbon. And scientists use this to date organic materials such as recent fossils, bones, trees, coal, and even human artifacts are dated using carbon-14 dating. First, let me explain what carbon-14 dating is about. Carbon is an element, a type of atom that usually has a mass of 12. That's atomic mass of 12. However, if nitrogen in the atmosphere is struck by solar radiation, it can be converted into this unstable radioactive form of carbon, which has a mass of 14. Because of this process, both forms of carbon, carbon-12, the normal carbon-12, and carbon-14, exist in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Both forms of carbon dioxide are then taken up by plants and used in photosynthesis to make glucose. And it ultimately becomes part of other macromolecules in the plant, like starch and nucleic acids or proteins. And when eaten by animals, the carbon-14 becomes part of their makeup as well. So all organisms on Earth will have the exact same amount of carbon-12 and carbon-14 in their tissues that is in the atmosphere. But because carbon-14 is unstable, it will decay back into nitrogen over time. So after the death of an organism, the amount of carbon-14 in the bones or fossils can be used as a measure of how long it's been dead based on the carbon-14 decay rate. Okay? Well, these measurements are done using a device called an atomic mass spectrometer, shown here. The rate group that we talked about before had a number of samples of coal measured for carbon-14 content using this device. Well, unlike the other isotopes used in radiometric dating, carbon-14 decays very quickly, having a half-life of only 5,730 years. So no carbon-14 is expected to remain in fossils after 100,000 years. The oldest samples that can be reliably measured by this process are 50,000 years old or less. Yet carbon-14 has been detected in ancient fossils, supposedly up to hundreds of millions of years old, ever since the earliest days of radiocarbon dating. In fact, between 1984 and 1998 alone, the secular scientific literature reported carbon-14 in 70 samples that came from fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, and marble, representing the fossil-bearing portion of the geologic record supposedly spanning more than 500 million years. Further analysis of fossilized wood and coal samples supposedly spanning 32 to 350 million years in age yielded dates between 20,000 and 50,000 years using carbon-14 dating. But carbon-14 in coal is really completely expected from a young Earth model of the fossil record. The plants that were alive at the time of the global flood were believed to have formed the vast coal deposits we find in the strata and are thus not millions of years old, but rather less than 5,000 years of age. The original carbon-14 content representing what was present in the atmosphere before the flood began to decay back to nitrogen after the flood. However, one of the problems with measuring samples like coal for carbon-14 content is that such materials are prone to contamination. Coal is a porous material. Stuff can leach into it, leach out. So the rate group decided to test for carbon-14 in diamonds, which can be thoroughly treated to remove contaminants. The rate group found that diamonds, supposedly 1 to 3 billion years old, yielded carbon-14 ages of only 55,000 years. This date is excessively old according to the Bible, but we need to recognize that there are serious problems with the assumption of this dating technique as well. High carbon-14 quantities in ancient pre-flood samples is very likely due to the fact that the magnetic field has decayed over time and was stronger in the past, protecting the atmosphere from solar radiation and reducing the radiocarbon production before the flood. As a result, plants and animals incorporated less radiocarbon into their cells before the flood, and their deaths occurred much more recently than expected. So the radiocarbon ages of all fossils and coals should be reduced to less than 5,000 years, matching the timing of their burial during the flood. The age of diamonds should be reduced to approximately the time of the biblical creation, about 6,000 years ago.